Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. On this week's video, we're concluding our new series entitled, What's the Point? So I want to say congratulations to you. Today is part 3 of section 3 of this new series. And by way of review, I'd like to just summarize what we've talked about up to this point in time. In section 1 of this program, we talked about important principles involved with the physical examination. And we talked about the main take-home message, or what's the point, with regards to reflex testing, with regards to sensory testing, and then also we talked about the importance of fashioning your physical examination procedures for the assessment of the presence or absence of permanent impairments, rather than using your typical physical examination procedures that you would employ in your clinical practice for the assessment of a diagnosis. And we talked about the subtle nuance and the subtle mental shift in thinking between examining for permanent impairments compared to examining for a diagnosis. And then in section 2 of this program, we spent some time talking about the new QME conservatism, and that was a fascinating discussion. Again, there were 3 parts in that discussion, and we talked about the new QME conservatism with regards to your determination of AOE, COE, with regards to your determination for the rating of permanent impairment. And then in those cases where you do opine for a permanent impairment rating, we talked about a new conservative approach to the assignment of your apportionment percentages. And we summarized that section by stating that in those cases where the examinee ends up with a permanent impairment rating, that represents an examinee who's failed to fully recover to pre-injury status. And the question that should come to your mind in that situation is why? Why has the examinee failed to recover to pre-injury status? Well, there's usually many factors that contribute to a failed response to treatment, and those many factors need to be apportioned out in your final apportionment determination. So don't be surprised if you're providing for low or even 0% percentages of the permanent impairment being due to the industrial injury, and very, very high or even 100% of the permanent impairment being due to other factors. And this is a new conservative approach that takes into consideration that examinees present to us with a myriad of other factors going on. Well, then we began section 3 of this program, and in section 3 we did a 180-degree turnaround from our conservative discussions in part 2, and in part 3 of this program we talked about more liberal approaches to your opinions and conclusions, and we cited our authority for taking a new liberal approach as coming from the AMA guides and then also coming from the Almarez and Guzman decisions. It's those two decisions, or those 2 references I should say, those 2 sources of authority that give us tremendous liberation and tremendous freedom to exercise our clinical judgment to come up with permanent impairment ratings that are quite a bit more liberal and quite a bit more aggressive than those that are provided for in the AMA guides. And so in section 1 of the 3rd part of this program, we talked about the Almarez and Guzman decision, the philosophy behind the Almarez and Guzman decisions, and we talked about how to provide for alternative impairment ratings in those cases wherein you feel that the permanent impairment rating that's provided for under the strict application of the AMA guides is not, in your opinion, is not a true and accurate representation of the examinee's true condition. So we talked about how to do that. It's much more involved than simply scouring through the 4 corners of the AMA guides to come up with different descriptions of the examinee's condition. Your alternate description of the examinee's condition must satisfy and must overcome 2 tall hurdles. Number 1, your opinion or your description should constitute substantial medical evidence. And then number 2, your description of the alternative impairment rating must satisfy 4 criteria. And we'll review those here in just a couple minutes. But we said that in order to rebut the AMA guides, your opinion on an alternative rating has to be good, has to be solid, has to be based on pertinent facts. It has to constitute substantial medical evidence, and then it has to satisfy 4 additional criteria as well. So these are tall hurdles. These are high hurdles that you have to overcome in those cases where you provide for an alternative impairment rating. And then in section 2, we showed how this is done out in the field, how this is done with actual cases. And I shared with you a couple cases where the alternative rating was upheld because the doctor did a fabulous job in fashioning his alternative impairment rating. And then I shared with you a couple of examples where the alternative impairment rating was not upheld. The judge denied or declined to accept the alternative impairment rating because it was the judge's final opinion that the alternative impairment rating was unable to satisfy those steep criteria. Number 1, of substantial medical evidence, and then number 2, of explaining how and why the strict rating as provided under the AMA guides was not accurate, and on the other hand, why the alternative impairment rating was more accurate. So in those cases where you're unable to satisfy the criteria, your alternative rating will properly be rejected, and the parties will simply default to the strict impairment rating as is provided for in the AMA guides. So today I want to conclude section 3 of this program, and I want to conclude the entire program by just saying a few more words about Almarez and Guzman. And I want to share with you several more cases that I have here with me that illustrate these principles. Again, the principles that we can use the entirety of the 4 corners of the AMA guides to come up with alternative impairment ratings. And I'm going to share with you some cases where doctors have been very creative in applying descriptions from chapters in the AMA guides that you would never associate with the physical condition being evaluated. In fact, in one case I'm going to share with you, the doctor analogized to chapter 3, which is the cardiovascular chapter, for musculoskeletal conditions, conditions of the hip, conditions of the spine, conditions of the knee. She analogized to deconditioning and loss of capacity for physical exercise in chapter 3. This is one I've never heard of. So I'm going to share with you some creative examples of proper and effective uses of Almarez and Guzman ratings. And I'm going to share with you a couple cases where, again, despite the doctor's attempt to provide an alternative impairment rating, the doctor failed to adequately explain how and why the alternative rating was more accurate than the strict rating, and that rating simply was not upheld. So that's our agenda for today, and I have as many as 7 cases that I want to share with you today, and we'll just go through these cases one by one and handle as many of them as we have time for. Now, I've provided references to these cases in today's blog, so I hope you have those printed out and available, because we're going to go over them one by one, and this will give you an opportunity to highlight significant and important points from each of those cases for your later use when it comes time in your own practice to provide for alternative impairment ratings. So I'll give you a minute to just go ahead and print out and assemble those resources, and I look forward to being back with you here in just a minute as we conclude our new program entitled What's the Point? And today our final discussion includes Almarez and Guzman's number 1 hits. my cases printed out. I hope you have your cases printed out as well. And I suggest that you review each of these cases in their entirety on your own time, because each of these cases are illustrative of one or more of the principles that we've been talking about throughout this discussion. So before we get into our first case, let's just review that the Almarez and Guzman decision allows us as doctors to utilize any chart, any chapter, any table, any method within the four corners of the AMA guides that, in our opinion, is a more accurate description of the examinee's true impairment on the date of our evaluation. In other words, when we have an examinee who's now at a permanent and stationary condition, we're charged with providing the permanent impairment rating. So with this new philosophy, we provide that permanent impairment rating two ways. Number one is our first obligation is to provide a permanent impairment rating under the strict application of the AMA guides. In other words, we use the chapter associated with the medical condition. We use the charts, tables, and instructions in the AMA guides to come up with what the AMA guides originally intended to be the impairment rating for this and similar conditions, this and similar medical conditions. So we provide a permanent impairment rating under the strict application of the guides. Well, then we scour the four corners of the AMA guides to come up with an alternative impairment rating in those cases when an alternative impairment rating is a better description, or in those cases when the AMA guides fails to describe or poorly describes the medical condition that we are assessing. For example, in a minute, I'm going to share with you a case that involves plantar fasciitis. The AMA guides do a poor or no job in discussing permanent impairment to plantar fasciitis. So this is a perfect opportunity to use an alternative impairment rating. Well, the purpose of the alternative impairment rating is to provide a more accurate, and that's the language that was described in Almarez and Guzman, more accurate description of the examinee's impairment. So let me ask you, what is meant by the term more accurate? What does more accurate mean? What does more accurate refer to? Interesting question, huh? Well, let me tell you that more accurate does not refer to the numeric permanent impairment rating that you provide for, either under the strict use of the AMA guides or under Almarez and Guzman. It has no relationship, no bearing on the numeric rating. As doctors, we really have no knowledge as to how these numeric permanent impairment ratings translate into permanent disability percentages after adjustment for age and occupation. We have no knowledge as to how these permanent impairment ratings then become compensated by using charts and tables down at the disability evaluation unit. We don't know the dollar figures of these numeric ratings. So when we provide for an alternative impairment rating, one of the things that we have to be cautious and careful of is that we're not simply providing for a higher numeric permanent impairment rating. In fact, Almarez and Guzman decisions specifically admonish us against this. They admonish us against using an alternative impairment rating simply to achieve a better result. And in this case, or in this sense, a better result simply refers to a higher compensable permanent impairment rating. That's not what's meant by the term accurate. In fact, you may find that when you provide an alternative impairment rating under Almarez and Guzman, the numeric rating may even be less, maybe less than that provided for by the AMA guides. And if that's more accurate, that's okay. It's not related to the numeric permanent impairment ratings, okay? So what is meant by the term more accurate? Well, more accurate refers to the description of the impairment and the description of the impact of the impairment on the examinee's ability to perform activities of daily living. And that's how these alternative impairment ratings, when they are upheld, this is the reason that they are upheld, is because they provide a more complete, a more in-depth, and a more accurate description of the impact of the condition on the examinee's ability to perform activities of daily living. And I'll share with you some examples of that as we go. So keep that in mind, that accuracy refers to the description of the impairment, not its numeric rating, okay? And the impact of that condition on activities of daily living, okay? So let me give you some examples of that. The first case I want to review with you is the Cannon case. Now, we've reviewed the Cannon case in prior discussion, but this is a fascinating case that applies to Almarez and Guzman, and I want to review it with you here today. So in the Cannon case, Mr. Cannon was a police officer with the city of Sacramento, and as a result of being on his feet for prolonged periods of time, he developed plantar fasciitis of the right foot. Have you ever had plantar fasciitis of your feet or foot? Okay? Well, if you've ever had plantar fasciitis, you know that it can be a pain in the foot, but that it typically resolves, and it resolves without sequelae. I don't know about you, but I've had plantar fasciitis in one or the other of my feet about 5 or 8 times. And right now as we speak, thank God, both of my feet are completely asymptomatic, and I can do whatever I want, unrestricted by prior plantar fasciitis. Well, Mr. Cannon was declared to be permanent and stationary. And on the day of the qualified medical evaluation, the orthopedic evaluator found that Mr. Cannon had basically a normal physical exam of the foot. Okay, plantar fasciitis, resolved plantar fasciitis leaves an examinee with a normal foot, or at least a normal physical exam. Well, the only complaint that Mr. Cannon had was he had some minimal subjective complaints with pain in the foot on prolonged weight bearing. That makes sense, correct? If you have ever had plantar fasciitis, you notice that sometimes standing in long lines at the bank or the grocery store or what have you can make your feet a little uncomfortable. And that's what Mr. Cannon described, is minimal subjective complaints following resolved plantar fasciitis. Well, the orthopedic evaluator found a normal exam, and under the strict application of the AMA guides, found for 0% whole person impairment. There was no positive objective physical exam findings for loss of function of the foot, and so he opined for 0% whole person impairment. Well, applicant attorney wrote to the evaluator and said, is there an alternative rating under Almarez and Guzman that you can conceive of, that you can consider, that is a more accurate description of Mr. Cannon's impairment? Well, the orthopedic evaluator thought about this, and he provided a supplemental report wherein he opined that Mr. Cannon's permanent impairment was similar by analogy to gait derangement in Chapter 17. Now this is fascinating. It's fascinating because Mr. Cannon did not have gait derangement. Okay? This is fascinating because the lowest level of gait derangement in Chapter 17 involves an antalgic limp with a shortened stance phase and moderate to advanced degenerative changes on diagnostic x-rays. So that would include degenerative changes of the hip, of the knee, or in the case of Mr. Cannon, we would expect to see some degenerative changes around the ankle or in the foot that contribute to an antalgic limp with a shortened stance phase. Okay? Now, the orthopedic evaluator did not obtain x-rays of the ankle, heel, or foot, so he could not document the second component of the description of gait derangement in Chapter 17, and that is moderate to advanced degenerative changes. In fact, I think he stated that Mr. Cannon did not have degenerative changes based on earlier or prior X-ray studies. So this is fascinating. Mr. Cannon did not have an antalgic limp. He did not have a shortened stance phase. He did not have moderate to advanced degenerative changes on diagnostic studies, but the orthopedic evaluator opined that Mr. Cannon's limitations in activities of daily living were limitations with weight-bearing activities. He analogized Mr. Cannon's limitations to those limitations that we would simply refer to as limitations with weight-bearing activities. So Mr. Cannon has limitations with prolonged standing, prolonged walking, running for distances, weight-bearing activities. Well, the analogy comes in, and the Almarez and Guzman alternative rating comes in and applies in this case because people with an antalgic limp, people with a gait derangement out of table 17.5, they also have limitations with weight-bearing activities. So can you see this analogy? The analogy is not an analogy to similar medical conditions. The analogy is to similar limitations in activities of daily living. In other words, those people who qualify for gait derangement are people who have limitations in weight-bearing activities. Can you see that? And the orthopedic evaluator analogized Mr. Cannon to those people that qualified, or those people that had limitations in weight-bearing activities. A fascinating analogy, but Mr. Cannon actually had none of the physical exam findings and none of the medical conditions that classically contribute to a gait derangement. Now, by coincidence, I recently had the opportunity to speak with the orthopedic medical evaluator. He was at a QME continuing education seminar, and amazingly, he was seated right next to me on my left. And as the discussion of this case came up on break, I had the opportunity to speak with him about his opinion, and I asked him to explain to me how did he analogize to gait derangement when Mr. Cannon had no gait derangement, had no antalgic limp, had no shortened stance phase, had no degenerative changes on diagnostic studies, and had a normal physical exam. How do you analogize to such a condition? And he simply said that it seemed to him that Mr. Cannon had minimal limitations, minimal, he admitted that they were minimal, limitations with weight-bearing activities, especially prolonged weight-bearing activities, and that was similar by analogy to the lowest level of gait derangement provided for in Chapter 17. So that increased Mr. Cannon's permanent impairment rating from 0% to 7% whole person. A huge, huge increase from 0 to 7% simply by analogy to limitations with weight-bearing activities. So I want you to remember that analogy. You may find some use for that yourself in the future. Okay, the next case I want to review with you is the Cortez case. Now in the Cortez case, this is also another illustration of Almarez and Guzman. The impairments, Mr. Cortez had injury to the lumbar spine, and when he was declared to be permanent and stationary, the evaluator opined that Mr. Cortez qualified for permanent impairment number 1 due to DRE, lumbar spine category 2, for 5% whole person impairment. And then also, under Almarez and Guzman, the evaluator provided for additional permanent impairment by analogy to hernia in Table 6.9 on page 136. Now, you're probably familiar with these analogies to hernia. And the reason that lumbar spine injuries can be analogized to impairments due to lumbar spine injuries can be analogized to impairment due to inguinal or abdominal hernia is because both conditions can cause limitations in lifting activities. Certainly, if you have a lumbar spine injury, you're going to be limited in your lifting activities. Well, what's fascinating about this case is not that the doctor analogized to the impairment due to inguinal hernia due to impact on lifting activities, but that he provided for permanent impairment due to both. He provided for permanent impairment both to the DRE2 category and also to by analogy to hernia. And in this case, the judge upheld the alternative impairment rating by combining the DRE2 at 5% with analogy to hernia at 19% for a total permanent impairment rating of 20%. So a 5% permanent impairment rating due to the DRE under the strict application of the guides was escalated and elevated to 20%, a quadrupling of the permanent impairment rating simply by invoking analogy to lifting activities. So if you're going to employ analogy to hernia, the important discussion and the important argument to make is the impact on lifting activities. So this is particularly important in examinees who are involved in heavy lifting, both in their activities of daily living and also in their work activities. In fact, for some examinees, limitations on lifting activities is sufficient to take them out of their pre-injury usual and customary work duties and preclude them from returning to their pre-injury and usual and customary work duties. So that may be the type of examinee that, in your opinion, qualifies for this additional or combined impairment by analogy to hernia. Okay, very interesting. Next one I want to share with you, and we're just going to go through these very quickly because I have 6 or 7 of these to share with you. This is the Sanchez-Mejia case. Again, a case that involves a massive multiplication of the permanent impairment rating. Miss Sanchez-Mejia had an injury to her left knee. The left knee required a medial meniscectomy procedure, and that was it. That was the only procedure that she underwent, and at the conclusion of rehabilitation and physical therapy, she was declared to be permanent and stationary, and the doctor rated her under the strict application of the AMA guides at 1%, 1% whole person impairment. That's all that's allowed for in table, I think it's table 17.7 of the AMA guides for medial meniscectomy. It's 1%, because under the strict application of the AMA guides, a medial meniscectomy does not significantly impair activities of daily living. Once it's repaired, people generally go on to do fine, they recover, and they resume near pre-injury level of physical function. I myself, I've had my medial meniscus completely removed when I was 17. I'm now 55, and I've had no problems with it whatsoever, even in the absence of a medial meniscus. Not a meniscectomy, but a complete removal of the medial meniscus. So the guides provide for only 1%. Well, in this case, the doctor analogized Miss Sanchez-Mejia's knee condition to 2 things, both a gait derangement and number 2, a loss of lifting capacity by analogy, again, to inguinal hernia. So very interesting. Here, we see that inguinal hernia is being invoked or analogized to in relation to a lower extremity injury. With our prior case, the Cortez case, we saw inguinal hernia and loss of lifting capacity being analogized with regards to a lumbar spine injury. So this analogy can be used for any condition that affects lifting capacity. Does that include upper extremity conditions? Of course it does. If an upper extremity condition adversely impacts lifting. So we can use it for spine injuries, we can use it for lower extremity injuries, we can use it for even upper extremity injuries. And in this case, the permanent impairment rating went from 1% for medial meniscectomy to 28% whole person, when the impairments for medial meniscectomy at 1% was combined with gait derangement at 7%, which was then combined with loss of lifting capacity at 19%. So a huge 2,800% increase in the permanent impairment rating, which in this case, it was upheld. It was upheld. The judge upheld this permanent impairment rating. Let me just read from the case a couple of the main conclusions. The defense, of course, argued that there was duplication and overlap in the impairment assessment. Okay, because number one is that Chapter 17, Table 17.2, the cross usage chart, tells us that permanent impairments due to gait derangement stand alone. They cannot be combined with other impairments. Well, the first Almarez and Guzman liberty that the evaluator took in this case was to combine the impairments due to meniscectomy with impairment due to gait derangement. So that was the first disregard for the strict application of the guides. The guides tell us that these impairments cannot be combined, but in this case the doctor began his alternative impairment rating by disregarding the cross usage chart and combining the impairments. So of course the defense argued about that. On physical exam, the evaluator found that Miss Mejia had a limp. So this is an important principle. So the doctor did indeed have physical exam findings in support of a permanent impairment for gait derangement. Remember, with the Cannon case, there were no positive physical exam findings for gait derangement. It's my opinion, if you're going to invoke and analogize to gait derangement, you should do a fabulous gait evaluation. You should have some gait findings, but as we learned in the Cannon case, by analogy to activities of daily living, positive physical exam findings are not absolutely necessary to invoke permanent impairment by analogy to gait. Okay? And that's basically the take-home message on that case. She had analogy to gait derangement, analogy to hernia, had a medial meniscectomy, and then finally, what the doctor did is rather than combining these impairments, he simply added them in complete disregard for the combined values chart on page 604. So this Sanchez-Mejia case represents multiple liberties, multiple exercises of clinical judgment, and multiple disregards for multiple tables and multiple instructions in the AMA guides in coming up with an alternative rating. And guess what? It was upheld. Because the judge in this case felt that the doctor did an adequate job explaining how and why the alternative impairment rating was a more accurate description than the description given under the strict application of the AMA guides. And look what it did to the permanent impairment numeric rating. It bumped that rating from 1% to 28% whole person impairment, which in my opinion is just simply incredible. Simply incredible. Next case I want to share with you is the Terracina case. And Mr. Terracina had an industrial injury on a cumulative basis to his spine, right shoulder, right wrist, left knee, had hypertension and gastroesophageal reflux, causing permanent disability of 65% whole person. Well, for the orthopedic side of the permanent impairment, the evaluator provided for permanent impairment of the upper extremity due to loss of grip strength. And then for the lower extremity injury, the qualified medical evaluator provided for permanent impairment due to gait derangement. Okay? So initially, the workers' comp judge did not allow the permanent impairment due to loss of grip strength because the loss of grip strength rating was provided for under the alternative rating under Almarez and Guzman. Now, in this case, Miss Terracina suffered injury to her right upper extremity. And the injury was that she suffered tenosynovitis of the thumb tendons. Now, if you've ever evaluated those cases, you know that those cases involve quite a bit of pain on repetitive motions of the hand. So the workers' comp judge disallowed the permanent impairment rating due to grip strength loss because the AMA guides specifically tell us that loss of strength cannot be rated in the presence of pain or painful conditions that prevent the effective application of force. However, in controverting this, or in getting around this, or I should say this was overturned, this was appealed and overturned, because the doctor who evaluated the case specifically stated that the applicant was able to make a full fist on examination with no elicited pain with mobility. Also, there was also no areas of tenderness to palpation about the hands, fingers, and thumbs. Isn't that amazing? This woman has active tenosynovitis of the hand, and yet on physical exam, she coincidentally does not have pain, is able to make a full fist, has no pain on palpation of the hand, wrist, or fingers, and therefore qualifies for a permanent impairment rating due to loss of grip strength. And the workers' comp judge initially rejected this because he felt that tenosynovitis was a painful condition. But the doctor effectively anticipated that by reporting that Mrs. Terracina did not have pain that would prevent the use of a permanent impairment rating due to loss of grip strength. So that's one thing. Second thing is with regards to the lower extremity, she had a right knee injury and she was rated at 7% whole person impairment. 7% whole person impairment due to weakness or loss of strength of the right knee. 7%. Well, that 7% impairment rating was increased to 12% by analogizing to gait derangement versus knee weakness. And the evaluator provided for the higher rating, the 12% rating, and then tried to combine those two due to weakness and due to gait derangement. But at this point, the judge stepped in and he said that according to the cross usage table, which is table 17.2, these impairments cannot be combined. And although the evaluator provided a good explanation as to why Ms. Terracina qualified for permanent impairment due to gait derangement versus knee weakness, he provided a good argument for that. He did not provide a good argument as to why these impairments should be combined when Table 17.2 specifically tells us that under the strict application of the guides, these cannot be combined. So what we're seeing here is mixed applications and mixed acceptances of alternative ratings. In this case, the judge accepted alternative ratings for the upper extremity. He accepted an alternative rating for the lower extremity, but he did not accept an alternate rating due to disregard of the cross-usage chart, because with regards to the discussion disregarding the cross-usage chart, here the doctor failed to adequately explain how and why those impairments should be combined in disregard for the cross-usage chart. So the doctor's good arguments were upheld and accepted. Where he provided for poor or weak arguments, those were properly rejected. Very interesting, very interesting. Okay, the next case I want to share with you is the Ramirez case, and I think we can probably just conclude here with the Ramirez case. It's a fascinating case. Mr. Ramirez suffered an injury arising out of and occurring in the course of his employment to his left shoulder, left wrist, left thumb, neck, and psyche. And when it came time to provide for permanent impairment for the left thumb, the qualified medical evaluator ran into some difficulty. Now, by way of history, Mr. Ramirez had 2 surgical procedures on the left thumb. And these surgical procedures, combined with the injury, left the thumb with some deformity, and then also left the thumb with some loss of function, some weakness and what have you. Well, under the strict application of the AMA guides, the permanent impairment rating for the thumb rated only 1%. 1% on the basis of weakness of the thumb. And let me read to you what the doctor said about this. This is the qualified medical evaluator. He said in his report, he said the AMA guides did not address the deformity and the surgeries to the left thumb. Later, at his deposition, the doctor testified that although he considered the strict AMA guides rating of 1% whole person impairment for applicant's left thumb, he considered it. The applicant has had 2 operations on that joint. He had a serious problem with the joints, and just on a common sense evaluation of whole person impairment for such a serious condition for that thumb, he said, I don't think 1% would be a common sense whole person impairment. Here, the doctor invoked common sense in his reasoning to rebut the permanent impairment rating under the strict application of the guides. Okay? So he instead chose to rate the thumb impairment by loss of grip strength. And so what happened was that applicant's disability is best described by grip loss rather than a strict application of the AMA guides, and the permanent impairment rating for the thumb went from 1% to 16% due to loss of strength, loss of grip strength. And Mr. Ramirez whole person impairment related to all of his industrial injuries went from 36% whole person to 51% whole person impairment. So I want you to notice the dramatic impact that these alternative ratings can have on the whole person impairment rating. Now, we haven't seen any cases wherein the alternative rating provides for a lower permanent impairment percentage, but I want you to know that those cases do exist, and if in your opinion the alternative rating provides for a lower numeric permanent impairment rating, you still need to go ahead and opine for the lower rating if you're opining that the alternative rating is more accurate. In other words, you have to remove from your mind that providing for alternative impairment ratings simply provides for a better result, meaning a higher permanent impairment rating for the examinee. The whole purpose of providing for an alternative impairment rating is that it's the more accurate description of the examinee's condition and of the impact of that condition on the examinee's ability to perform activities of daily living. So doctors, this concludes our discussion on the Almarez and Guzman decisions.